it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carmen, and thank you, Donna, and everyone at RUSA ETS for having us today. Welcome, everyone, to our presentation. We're going to talk and workshop with you some of our privacy literacy work. So my name is Sarah Hartman-Caverly. I'm presently actually on leave from Penn State Berks for declining to share my personal health data or medical decision-making with the university. But the lovely thing about being in knowledge work is that you carry your most important means of production with you wherever you go. So I'm here today under my own recognizance. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to my collaborator, Alex.
Hello, my name's Alex Chisholm, and I also am a reference and instruction librarian at Penn State Berks. And a collaborator with Sarah. We together, or it's going to get a little confusing today maybe, so I'll clarify this, but together we call our collaboration Digital Shred, but we'll also be talking about our Digital Shred workshop. So I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Exactly. So what we're going to do in the next hour together or so is give you a crash course in privacy literacy, where we're going to nerd out on some of the theory that we incorporate into our privacy literacy pedagogy. We'll give you an introduction to our particular approach to privacy literacy. We'll walk you through an abridged version of our original Digital Shred workshop, and then we're happy to open up the floor to questions and discussion. So we'll start with that crash course in privacy literacy. Our privacy literacy work is informed by Thilo Hagendorf's critique of common approaches to privacy literacy that he published in 2018 in an article called Privacy Literacy and Its Problems. So in this article, Hagendorf outlines 4 deficiencies in privacy literacy. First, when you consider privacy literacy as a form of social capital, that reveals existing social inequities that result in unequal access to privacy-related learning opportunities. Differences in privacy knowledge are observed along lines of educational attainment, income, age, race and ethnicity, and gender identity. These privacy literacy disparities can then perpetuate the social inequalities that are accomplished through the disparate impacts which institutionalized surveillance imposes on members of already marginalized and vulnerable communities. Second, Hagendorf questions the premise, the overriding premise, that users are purely rational actors with respect to privacy and disclosure, given the realities of persuasive design, digital resignation, algorithmic manipulation, and the persistent myths of the privacy paradox, or in my personal experience, just coercive measures that are used to compel data disclosure, right? Third, Hagendorf critiques the front-end focus of a lot of privacy literacy initiatives, which contributes to phenomena like technosolutionism and the control paradox. So the control paradox is actually an empirical observation that comes up in empirical research, where users that perceive that they have a greater control over their privacy controls end up disclosing more information than they otherwise would. So a kind of an incorrect perception about privacy control can actually lead to more vulnerability and more personal data disclosure than would otherwise occur. Finally, Hagendorf observes that user-centric privacy literacy perpetuates what he calls responsibilization. This is the shift of responsibility for privacy governance to typically disempowered users and away from states and corporations. Hagendorf concludes his critique with this call to action. This is where librarians come in and library workers. The problem is that privacy literacy is often understood as the ability to use software features which are provided at the front end of platforms and services. However, privacy literacy has to be more than just ticking boxes in the privacy settings. Privacy literacy should comprise the ability to consider involuntary information disclosures by other individuals, to be aware of hidden data collections in devices of the Internet of Things. So think surveillance capitalism here, Shoshana Zuboff's concept, right? And to know about missing privacy by default settings and so on. So when considering Hagendorf's critiques, Alex and I kind of knocked our heads together and asked, what could a person-centered approach to privacy literacy look like? After steeping ourselves in multidisciplinary privacy theories and then recentering on what privacy means to the library and information science domain, we arrived at this proposed definition for privacy literacy. a suite of knowledge, behaviors, and critical dispositions regarding the information constructs of selfhood, expressive activities, and relationships. Privacy is related to information literacy and addresses many of the metaphysical and social dynamics of information. In our digital shred collaboration, our guiding claim is that privacy plays a positive role in the human experience, even if your personal data is never misused or exploited in a data breach. In the 4 workshops comprising our annual privacy workshop series, of which Digital Shred the Workshop is one, we use this original 6 private eyes conceptual framework to emphasize this positive case for privacy and to illuminate hidden privacy harms that are easily overlooked when focusing purely on data flows and front-end privacy features. The 6 private eyes privacy framework depicts 6 concentric zones of those, quote, information constructs of selfhood, expressive activities, and relationships. These include identity or selfhood, intellect or our values, beliefs, creativity, ideation, and decision-making, and of course, intellectual freedom. Integrity, which comprises both bodily integrity or spatial privacy and contextual integrity. This is Helen Nissenbaum's term for when the right people know the right things about you at the right time because you are able to exercise some agency in your personal information flows. Intimacy or the confidentiality and shared privacy of close relationships or consultative relationships, think librarian, lawyer, doctor, etc. And then at its outermost sphere, interaction or the freedom of association, and isolation or the ability to voluntarily withdraw into solitude. So when you navigate this model from the inner core of identity to the outer sphere of social interaction, each zone of privacy is protected by an increasingly permeable boundary. Privacy literacy then supports the individual's awareness of, ability to negotiate, and will to advocate for these boundaries by understanding privacy first as a value system rather than purely a technology. In addition to visualizing the positive case for privacy, other benefits of our 6 private eyes model are that it's non-technical in nature. Of course, ETS, I know you're technical folks, but it's non-technical in nature, so it can help you communicate with the rest of us. And therefore, it's evergreen, transferable, and generalizable. It accounts for both individual and group privacy, and it's grounded in broad-based privacy theory from a range of disciplines. You can check out our 2020 paper in IFLA journal, Privacy Literacy Instruction Practices in Academic Libraries, Past, Present, and Possibilities, where this model first appeared. And then we also have its Creative Commons license. So if you like this model and you'd find it useful for communicating with stakeholders or for teaching, please feel free to grab the Creative Commons licensed copy from our Digital Shred Toolkit. So again, this overarching claim of the digital shred approach to privacy literacy is that privacy is about respect for persons, not just about protecting data. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to Alex.
All right, thank you, Sarah. And this is the last portion right before we dive into that workshop, so we'll get interactive in just a moment. But now I just want to dive a little bit deeper into our specific approach to privacy literacy. It'll be important because you're going to notice that our workshop is a little bit different than the typical privacy workshop. So first and foremost, we advocate for a holistic approach that presents the positive case for privacy and does not rely on those front-end feature techno-solutionism approaches that Sarah was talking about with the Hagendorf critique. As she also mentioned, it's generalizable and evergreen because it focuses on privacy as that value system, and we use that 6 private eyes framework. And having that control paradox that Sarah described earlier foremost in mind keeps us honest and resisting the temptation to simplify privacy instruction with a set of how-tos and tools that overpromise and underdeliver on privacy protections. We never want students to leave a workshop feeling overconfident in the ability of these technologies to actually safeguard their privacy. We want a realistic picture for them when they leave. We strive to focus on privacy in the context of students' lived experiences. And I know not all of you are working with students, so I should be saying patron, but all of our patrons' lived experiences. And we find that when we focus on the why of privacy, why privacy matters, patrons and individuals are motivated to figure out the how of achieving it. So we always focus on the why as opposed to how. Finally, we avoid prescriptive or proscriptive approaches to privacy and digital literacy. Our learning experiences are designed to be as open, exploratory, and participatory as possible, such that we're constantly learning from our students and they're learning from each other. We strive to respect their own lived experiences, values, and knowledge. That's very important to us. And lastly, before we dive into the workshop, we want to share some additional context for our student-facing privacy literacy learning experiences. However, no matter what context you're in, these are all transferable. This would work great in a public library format or possibly in probably more at the higher level, like high school level, but it would definitely work in other library contexts. The Creative Commons licensed Penn State Berks Privacy Workshop Series focuses on privacy issues for individuals in the past, present, and future. The Privacy Workshop, which is really our foundational one, spotlights personal and societal data collection practices in our current environment. Digital Leadership explores future implications of individuals' online persona and digital footprint. So that's really, when you hear the term digital citizenship, this one most closely aligns with that concept. Digital Shred, the workshop we're spotlighting today, provides tools to evaluate and mitigate the damage of past digital behaviors. And Digital Wellness focuses on privacy across the lifespan, bringing together the past, present, and future by finding a balance of technology and wellness while aligning habits and goals. Each workshop is grounded in theory, countering approaches that we talked about earlier that overpromise user control in the face of information asymmetries and that control paradox, and embrace students' autonomy and agency by avoiding those prescribed solutions. We instead encourage decision-making frameworks, which you're going to see a little bit of in our workshop coming up. And this is achieved through active learning, inclusive pedagogy, and metacognitive approaches that really leave room for participants to reflect. So you can feel free to explore our Creative Commons licensed lesson plans, materials, and activities. These are all open to be adapted, so they are available, and I'm sure Sarah can and will be dropping in a link if she hasn't already. Right, so now we're going to dive into our abridged workshop. Just to give you a heads up, we're going to be breaking the fourth wall a little bit because in order to fit this in, this 50-minute workshop, we're going to maybe truncate some of the activities or perhaps just discuss what the activity would entail before we move along. We're happy if you leave questions throughout the session in the chat, but we're going to hop into this right now. All right. And I'm sure Sarah is copying and pasting in some links for you to our workshop guide and also our lesson plan and materials right now. Right. So what are we doing today in this digital shred workshop? We will be reflecting on your digital privacy priorities, applying a growth mindset to critically examine your digital footprint, and developing a personal data integrity plan to help you, reach your goals after this workshop. We're going to start out with a game, and I'm going to break the fourth wall here as promised, just to save some time. But typically what we would do is play a fact or fiction game via Kahoot, which is a free online software to create a quiz. And we would typically be doing that interactive, but I'm instead going to show you some of our fact or fiction questions. So just for some context, as we go through this and we're playing it with our class, we would usually contextualize the answers for students. So we would talk a little bit and give some explanation as to why they are fact or fiction. And we really do this because our foundational privacy workshop, not everyone attending the digital shred workshop would actually have been there. So they might be missing out on some basic knowledge about data collection and behavioral surplus data. And we want to kind of catch them up on these practices. And so this accomplishes that for anybody attending that may not have been in the previous one. This typically takes like 5-10 minutes. And so for us, we're just looking at the examples of some questions. This really could be anything that you want your patrons to know before diving into the larger workshop. So this could obviously be modified based on your audience. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and we will no longer be breaking the fourth wall.
So what is digital shred? What are we here this afternoon to talk about? We define digital shred as the act of managing your privacy records or managing your privacy by curating digital records for purposes of data governance, risk management, and storage. You can also think of digital shred as strategies for mitigating privacy breaches by eliminating digital records as securely as possible. So let's unpack those three underlying concepts a little bit further. Again, digital shred applies the principles of data governance to achieve data minimization and storage efficiency. Data governance involves using some set of rules, tools, and practices to exercise control or action over a given data asset. So when we get to the point in the workshop where you're developing your personal data integrity plan, that's your data governance plan going forward for your personal data. Data minimization is a key risk management practice that involves collecting, using, accessing, or disclosing the minimum necessary personal information to accomplish a purpose. So the reality is that, especially in this day and age, you're never going to have completely 100% perfect privacy. You're always going to need to give some amount of data in order to accomplish something in the world. And more extreme cases of that are what Veronica Barassi calls the systemic coercion of digital participation. So the requirement that you give up some data for access to education, access to library materials, access to healthcare, access to employment, all of these things, right? But the idea of data minimization means that you're really aware of exactly what you're giving up and exactly what you're getting in return, and that you're only disclosing the exact minimal amount of information that you need in order to get the benefit or the information or resources that you're seeking. So that's data minimization. And then storage efficiency is kind of a funky term in this context, but it really refers to the idea that holding on to digital materials that are no longer useful makes it harder to manage your digital footprint and also presents the risks of data breaches and of behavioral profiling of your behavioral surplus. So what we're primarily interested in is helping you not become a prisoner to your data double. Adopting digital shred practices can help you manage your data double or your model data. This data double or model data results from the aggregation and analysis of your consciously given data, that information you know you're putting out in the world when you make an online purchase and you give your mailing address and your credit card info and your name, right? As well as the automatically monitored data or metadata whenever you're interacting in the digital environment. So this is the device you log in from, the time you log in, your geolocation based on IP address, the amount of time that you browse, where you click and hover on the screen, all of that activity, right? So those two sets of data, consciously given and automatically monitored or metadata, are combined using big data techniques like algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the resulting model data is then used to calculate things like your quantified attractiveness in a dating app, or your trustworthiness for employability purposes, or your creditworthiness, right? And these can affect your real life opportunities and experiences. So managing that data double using these digital shred strategies and techniques is going to help you optimize what that data double looks like, that model data looks like, in order to achieve what you want to achieve in the real world. The first step in our workshop will be to actually think about what does the ideal online portfolio, the ideal digital footprint or data double look like. So we're going to spend some time reflecting on developing a burner account. We're going to pop a link in the chat to our ideal portfolio worksheet, which offers you guiding questions to help you develop a privacy optimized burner account. What would your ideal account username or bio say? What phone number or email address would you use for the account, knowing that those pieces of metadata can associate your account and identity across platforms and contexts? What types of content will you post, share, like, follow, etc.? How often will you post? At what times of day? Will you share your location data? So these are all guiding questions for you to think through in terms of if you were to configure an account today, knowing what you know now, what would you put in that ideal kind of portfolio or the ideal burner account? So we'll spend a few minutes here for you to think through some of these answers, and I'm sure that Alex dropped a link to our fillable PDF in the chat for you if you want to record any of your thoughts. just take maybe another 30 seconds to finish up your current thought, and we'll regroup as a large group to sort of debrief on this activity. All right, let's regroup as a large group. And again, we're thinking about an ideal portfolio, an ideal burner account. So hopefully there's nothing really too sensitive, although if you wouldn't want to share anything from your reflection, that's also totally fine. But would anybody like to share anything out as you were reflecting on what would the kind of privacy ideal username or bio look like? What would the ideal activities or behaviors of this account look like? Anybody have any thoughts they'd like to share? Or anything that came to mind while you were working through this activity? Feel free to unmute or drop your thoughts in the chat and I can read them out. Melissa, I think you raised your hand. Feel free to either unmute or drop thoughts in the chat. Oh, I think you might be muted. Let me see if I can.
I got it. I'm trying, trying to go up to where I was on mute. I like the comment about being a nicer human. I think not responding to posts that you see on Facebook when you're angry would probably be a great idea. I'm liking that one. That's my reaction. I'm liking that one very much.
I appreciate that you called that out. And one of the interesting things about Facebook is it's, you know, as you said, good to remember there's another human, presumably, possibly a bot, but probably a human on the other side of that interaction or observing that interaction, right? The other thing that's creepy about Facebook is they made news at one point for actually keeping everything that you typed into the interface, whether it was a direct private message or a post that you ended up not actually posting and submitting. So that everything typed in there becomes part of that kind of shadow text of your data double, even if you never actually send it, which is interesting to think about how that might affect your data double and the way that you're profiled, even if you never send it in a visible capacity. So yeah, that's a great observation. Did you want to say more on that?
Yeah, the other thing interesting about Facebook that I found out not long ago is that like if you use their icons and you put an angry one, the content gets boosted like significantly higher in your feed than if you use just a regular old like one. So we are being primed to discover angry content by Facebook, which leads us to inflame, perhaps be more inflammatory in our responses. It just seems like a vicious cycle that, Facebook shouldn't be doing that.
That's a really great observation, especially given the state of discourse generally, that we're essentially being rewarded through the engineering of these platforms, essentially socially engineered to be inflammatory and angry. There was a really fascinating study. It's now, I think, about 8 years old, but it was about social contagion on Facebook. And they actually modified people's news feeds, some to be more positive and some to be more negative, to see what the resulting behavior was, and if that positivity or negativity would percolate through people's Facebook networks by them reposting that content or sharing content that was more in line with the positive or negative tweak to their news feeds. And they found that there is, in fact, a social contagion element to the way that content is shared on Facebook. And of course, I'm sure we've all experienced the adage that misery loves company, right? That it's much easier to spread negativity than positivity. So yeah, thank you for that observation. And I didn't quite know that they were still kind of rewarding the use of their angry or negative icons in the way that your content is boosted. So that's really interesting to know. I wanted to highlight some comments that came in through the chat, and just if anybody wants to expand on this, feel free. I see that Donna said that the ideal portfolio would be bland. So pursuant to what Melissa's talking about, that's exactly right. Probably not inflammatory. I saw someone comment recently that like the safest thing to do is post pictures of your pets, right? Like that's very non-controversial. So bland, and then Carmen's observing a username that couldn't be traced back to you, never revealing phone number and address, right? It's really interesting, but for, I believe most of Facebook's history, it was the norm to have real name policies that you had to use your real identity name, which has a number of implications, not least of which is potentially dead naming, right? But your real name used in your account. I think people have slowly shifted away from that, or maybe use combinations of first and middle name or maiden names, or other identifiers that can be construed as real name or compliant with real name policies, but aren't quite how you're currently known in the world. But exactly, that just creates that match point of metadata, as we know as library workers, to associate other accounts and context with your Facebook feed. And then again, Carmen saying, hearing about things that colleagues are posting on Facebook, some of it's not flattering or things that you want to know. So there's that idea of context collapse that Dana Boyd has talked about, where, there are certain relationships that we want to kind of keep this arm's distance with, right? Or only know people and appreciate them in certain contexts. And that requires contextual integrity. That's back to that Nissenbaum concept of only knowing the right things about the right people at the right time. And social media has really incentivized us to overshare, right? Share too much information about ourselves in ways that break down those natural social walls between our different identities and roles. And that can create some tension and discomfort when you find out things that you really would rather not know about people that you have to work with or interact with in other spheres of your life. So that's a great observation. And then from Stacey Ann, we have using a variation of your name and just give emails. Yeah, and there's actually some services, I'm sure they're in the toolkit, if not in this workshop guide, that kind of creates temporary email aliases that you can use for registering for different services. So that might be something that you find useful. Yeah, thank you so much for those observations on the ideal burner account. Just briefly breaking the fourth wall in terms of how we would use this with patrons. In our instance, that would be typically first year undergraduate students, although any student at our campus is welcome to join in. We would point out things like time of day posting. So there's a really fun website we use in our basic privacy workshop called click that actually records things like times of day and makes the observation, you access this platform during the workday. So you can imagine the implications of that for workplace monitoring and workplace surveillance if your employer has the opportunity to monitor your web traffic and behavior and look at the platforms and activities that you're engaging with throughout the workday when you're supposed to be on the clock, right? Other things to keep in mind for just threat modeling and safety reasons would be things like location tagging, EXIF data and photos that you're posting. If there's a reason that you want to keep your location private or maybe need to keep your location private, so think about patrons or loved ones that might have protective orders in place against people in their lives, you want to be really sensitive about giving up any kind of geolocation data. So these are just some additional tips that we would point out to participants in our workshop along the way when we're going through this ideal portfolio activity. All right, moving right along. So now that we've had an opportunity to think about what a privacy optimized burner account would look like and behave like, let's start to think about comparing that to our actual online presence using what's called a damage assessment. You can also think about this as threat modeling. So this activity is actually adapted from actual threat modeling processes that are undertaken by US intelligence agencies and helps you evaluate the actual or potential damage resulting from a breach of privacy. The damage assessment activity will guide you in identifying systemic vulnerabilities in your online behavior and to develop a corrective action plan. The damage assessment asks, what risky digital behaviors do you engage in? And again, you're welcome to keep this private. We don't need you to share these necessarily. What sensitive data do you generate? What's the likelihood of a data breach, right? So you might have some high risk behaviors, but the likelihood of them being discovered is low. What could you do differently to manage these risky digital behaviors or to repair potential damage? And I'm sure if she hasn't already, that Alex will drop a link to this damage assessment activity in the chat. It's actually the second page of the ideal portfolio burner account that you just worked on. So feel free to review some of these questions. If you'd like to on your own end, drop some thoughts into your fillable PDF. And we will regroup for debriefing in just a couple of minutes. Again, this activity is obviously slightly more sensitive since we're now dealing with your real online activities. So if you have general observations you'd like to share, that's great. Alex and I have some thoughts that we can share, but we're obviously not interested in coercing or compelling anybody to disclose anything. So take a couple of minutes to review the Digital Shred Damage Assessment Worksheet.
And breaking that fourth wall, that's definitely a tip for teaching any privacy literacy experience. being non-coercive in participation. I actually have worked with some colleagues who are very, they like to force participation. And this is an area where we highly, we do not recommend that because it gets into sensitive areas, and we really want to respect and make a comfortable environment, a safe space for students or any patron to be sharing and thinking about these ideas. So.
So we'll take another minute or two on this activity. I see some great chatter in the chat. Thank you for that engagement. We'll just give everyone another minute or so to reflect and possibly type some thoughts into your personal fillable PDF. And then if folks would like to share, please feel free. We'll open up the floor to debrief with everyone. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and regroup, and we'll kind of debrief on where we're at with our digital shred damage assessment. Again, this can get into some sensitive areas, so please don't feel obligated to share out. If you'd like to make general comments, now's a great time to do it. I'm just going to read through some things that came up in the chat. There's some really great observations there. So Carmen Cole notes under vulnerabilities, selling my soul to Penn State when we were required to upload our vaccine status. As soon as they incentivized it with a free signed football and $100 gift card, they didn't give that to everyone. It was a drawing. Yeah, I think, you know, as you may have heard in my introduction, the pandemic has raised a lot of really interesting questions around this tension that gets built up between public safety and security and privacy, and whether or not those two things are necessarily mutually exclusive. I'd like to think that they aren't, right? And I think everyone acted in good faith in thinking that sharing a lot of personal health information was going to make everyone safer, without stopping to think about whether disclosing all of that information to various parties, including our employers, actually changed the game on the ground, right? Did that necessarily mean I was any more or less of a vector by disclosing that information to the employer, right? And of course, as Carmen notes, and this was very common also in the general public sector, there were a lot of incentives in place early on prior to mandates to get people to participate in vaccination drives and disclose vaccination statuses. Even some ones that kind of come into conflict with other public health measures. So giveaways of donuts and fries and alcohol and, where it was legal in some cases, cannabis. So, it's kind of an interesting thing to look back on in the earlier stages of the availability of vaccines and look at some of the interesting logic behind some of these incentive programs. But yeah, so that's a great example of, again, what Veronica Barassi would call the systemic coercion of digital participation. This idea that in order to gain access either to incentives or indeed to employment, you need to be giving up this data and participating in these various electronic platforms. I did, in response to Carmen, pop a really interesting, freely available open access preprint in the chat if you're interested in new work that's coming about the classification of data misuses. This is very complementary work to what Alex and I say about privacy being about respect for persons, not just protection for data. They don't take a data protectionist stance, but what they do is demonstrate how privacy harms use data to actually injure people, right, in various ways. So that preprint's available for you in the chat if you're interested. Victor shares that a while back he started using an email account created in the late 90s as a burner because it was inundated with junk mail, and then realized he had no idea what information he provided to open the account and how it was tied to him and his history. That was back in the day when receipts had your full credit card number and expiration date. So yeah, I'm thinking I have probably an America Online account floating around somewhere. Carmen says it's a really good point. She has a Hotmail account from a really long time ago. And Alex and I both share that, yeah, in the biz, we call these zombie accounts. And there's some resources in our guide, one of which Alex has posted in the chat that can help you identify these and potentially get them shut down. Melissa asks, what's meant by public posts in social media? Those that anyone can see rather restricting to friends. Yeah, that's exactly correct, Melissa. So depending on the social media platform, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, whatever, wherever you're engaging, you can often set the visibility of your posted content to either just folks in your friend and following circle, or they can be completely public. Of course, one thing that we would make sure that our students, our participants are aware of is, even if something's set to be very private and only viewable on the platform to other folks, any of those folks could either maliciously or not, take a screen cap of what you've posted and reshare it, and that could make it public. So that goes back to Dana Boyd's characteristics of properties of web data, right? One of which is replicability, the idea that once something is posted online, it's very easy to make a copy and to share it. And then it becomes more persistent and more discoverable and scalable. So it's kind of out there forever. Those are those 4 properties of web data. And Carmen says she got rid of that after thinking about what Victor noted. Can you specify got rid of your zombie account? Sorry.
Yeah, I made sure that I got everything out of it that I would need, like if people had sent me pictures or something, and shut it down. Yep. Also because at the time, Hotmail did not have a 2FA. And now that I'm using Gmail primarily, I'm not saying that Google isn't probably mining me for everything I'm worth. Yeah, at least there's 2FA, a couple different ways, and I feel like it's a little bit more secure.
Yeah, for sure. That authentication technology and just practices have come a long way since our early days of creating email aliases, right? Absolutely. Any other thoughts about the digital shred assessment, or we will move on to our personal data integrity plans? All right. So I believe at this point I am passing the mic over to Alex. So we're going to talk more about our actual digital shred strategies that we have in store for you, now that you may have identified some vulnerabilities in your digital footprint.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So now we're going to talk about what you can do based on the priorities that you've identified or any risks that you've identified. We're going to figure out some next steps. So I dropped a link in the chat to our personal data integrity plan. But the first thing I'm going to do with you is give you the opportunity to take a look at a real life example of maybe accounts that might have been already compromised. This is a tool called Have I Been Pwned? And let me get a link to that and pop it in the chat for you. But you can all do this and share if you have some vulnerable accounts, maybe that were in a data breach. I know I do. My husband, who is not very privacy savvy, or he doesn't have as many cares about privacy, I was very annoyed to see that his accounts have less data leaks than mine, which was a bummer. But if everyone wants to take a moment before we dive into that worksheet and maybe type in one of their emails into this Have I Been Pwned? And I guess I'll be transparent. I'll just pop mine in and show you. I definitely am compromised. Wait, what? This isn't previous results for me, but and I don't know if in the chat, if anyone wants to just like acknowledge whether they have a clean account or if they have any data breaches. And another thing that we like to recommend for participants is, oh, it seems like people are listing out of theirs. Her AOL, Sarah's saying her AOL account, if she's remembering it correctly, has not been pwned, which is pretty impressive because I'm sure that's a very old account. But her Gmail has 13 data breaches. Yikes, right? Some people are saying they have 2, they have 1. Absolutely. And this is actually sometimes a great way to learn about maybe some accounts you forgot about. I certainly learned about a few accounts in the past by doing this. Another thing we like to recommend is to set up a Google search alert on your name or like even your email address. I've been surprised when I've searched my email address in Google, what I've learned in the different accounts that are associated with just my contact info by doing that Google search. So creating a search alert really helps protect you against maybe some information that's getting put out there or accounts that are being signed up for under your name. All right. But diving into that worksheet, I know I put the link in a little earlier. If you haven't already opened it up, I am going to actually do that myself here. And give me one moment, I apologize. So this is really a tool on breaking the fourth wall again that we use at the end of our workshop. It's partially a takeaway and partially an in-class activity, but we give participants an opportunity to go through and figure out based on their priorities that they've identified in the previous activities, maybe what accounts or areas they want to focus on. And we give them the opportunity. So we have things like smartphone, web browser, social media. They're able to select, this is a fillable PDF. We also provide paper ones, but they're able to select maybe what their device is and whatever their priority or risk level is based on the damage assessment. So maybe their Android phone is a high level risk that they're concerned about. And then based on that risk level, they can kind of give themselves an audit frequency. So how often do they want to check up on this account? Maybe you want to do it every month. Maybe you want to do it biannually, so twice a year. It's really up to them. And we even offer the suggestion that in some cases, you might want to just delete the account for sure. And then for next step resources, this is a place where Sarah and I leverage a toolkit that we created when we created this workshop. It's grown into more than just how-tos and tips. But as opposed to being in charge of developing these homegrown tip sheets and worksheets and directions on these technologies that are constantly a moving target, as you know, phones update, apps update, all these things are constantly developing and growing. We instead curate a toolkit where a lot of these resources that are already out there online, there's great articles available to us. They're available to our participants. And so we link out to those specific categories. I should probably just be sharing my entire screen to save myself the hassle. But we'll link out to specific areas that relate to our data integrity plan. So for the smartphone example, you can pop in and based on what you're looking for, you could come in, maybe you have an Apple phone or Apple products, you could come into their personal safety guide and find resources to help support your goals. We do curate on our LibGuide, which we use in the workshop, very specific resources that we think will be helpful. So we update this, I would say, every time we run the workshop, which is annually, and we just make sure that we put maybe the most relevant or common concerns on our curated list, but then the additional ones, so see more web browser privacy how-tos, we do give that participants the opportunity to dig into even more resources for them. So we'll give you a couple minutes to go through this worksheet. Again, we usually don't have time for participants to go through the entire thing. This is something that really requires some thought and consideration, but we give them an opportunity to really explore and get started in that process and then debrief before we would set them off into the world to continue their evaluations later. So you can go ahead and take a couple minutes to work on this before we debrief and do a Q&A. All right, so for the sake of time, I know we're closing soon. Maybe take another 30 seconds or so to look through the worksheet, maybe think about some resource that you found, or maybe a really high priority or high risk account or tool that you're looking to kind of mitigate harm from. And maybe you can share that out if you're interested in the chat, or we can discuss all of that for just a few minutes. All right, so just for the sake of time, I'm gonna move along. I see Carmen put in the chat about Apple and how they have a really nice cache of her medical data now that since she got the Apple Watch. And that's so true. And I see Sarah is pointing out the risk benefit analysis that goes into a lot of these technologies. And I would just say, particularly with Internet of Things devices, smart home devices, wearables, for sure. And I know before I was a little bit more savvy on this, so I'm talking like maybe 8 years ago, I had things like, I bought my husband an Alexa. So I introduced smart home devices to our home just willy-nilly, not thinking about it. And it turned into a fight later on where I removed all of it from our home and he wanted to keep it. So for sure, there's a lot that you have to consider when you're making these choices. And for some people, a wearable device like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch is a huge benefit and helps them reach their goals. And so it's just kind of one of those cost benefit analysis you have to do for yourself. And as Sarah pointed out, we have a digital wellness workshop where we talk about these exact concepts, and that's so true. So definitely check that out if you're interested. And oh, thank you, Carmen, for complimenting our article. Awesome. Oh, and yes, Sarah, smart baby monitors are really terrifying as well. And there's actually a lot of talk too about in nursing homes, having these devices to protect our loved ones. Because we're not able to be there, and there was a lot of controversy, particularly during the pandemic, when people were unable to visit their loved ones and really see the care that they were receiving, and there was less accountability because loved ones were not able to visit. So there's so many facets to smart home devices, and if you hadn't picked up on this already, Sarah and I could talk about this all day, every day, forever. So absolutely. If anybody else wants to add anything in the chat, please feel free. But I'm just going to move on and tell you kind of how we close this workshop up with our participants. Generally, when we've been fortunate enough to run the workshop in person, we do what we call Snowball Confessions, where we give participants a sheet of scrap paper, and they're able to respond to one or all of the prompts. What is one change and or step that you plan to take after this workshop? What is one bad digital habit you want to break? Or list something you learned today or something you wish you had learned. And then we ask them to crumple up their paper and throw it into the middle of the room. And then either participants or instructors pick up a sheet and read it out loud to the class, and we can kind of talk about these things. And it serves as a nice informal assessment for us as well on how the workshop went, or maybe some topics that students want us to focus on. So that is one way we've closed it out. When we run this online, we have a web form that we've used instead to collect some data and information from students on what they'd like to see. So that is kind of how we close out the workshop. But now we have like 6 minutes, I think, for any questions you might have for us, or to discuss some topics, anything that might be interesting to you, approaches that you take in your context. Thank you so much for joining us and letting us talk about this. As I said earlier, we'll talk forever about it.
Well, I wanted to say that I saved the chat so that I can give everyone on Connect, ALA Connect, links later on, just so they have all these wonderful resources. And I just really want to thank you, Alex and Sarah, for being with us today, presenting to us. This adds so much value for our members. And then just super quick, for our members that are here, I wanted to remind you that committee appointments are going to be coming up soon. You can, pick what you would like to volunteer for. I will be making the committee assignments. So you're also able to contact me. And usually they're fairly low stakes participation. So that's one of the things that's kind of cool about being an ETS, is like, you can be involved, but it's not going to take over your life. So we would love to have you with us for that. I don't have anything else. So if anybody has any questions. or comments?
Bird, I would be remiss not to mention this before we leave, but we mentioned our toolkit in regards to the digital shred workshop and how we curate how-tos. Toolkits to support the workshop. However, this is also really intended for librarians and educators who want to develop any sort of privacy literacy programming. So Sarah and I are very committed to supporting professionals in their development of learning activities. And so this toolkit has tabs that will help you with this. So there's a teaching materials tab where you might be able to find entire lesson plans, learning objects, different tools that will help support the development of teaching materials. The how-tos we already talked about. Case studies are something that we love to use in classes to give students an opportunity to really use critical thinking and explore how these issues impact different areas of society. So they're categorized into different areas depending on what your interest might be. You could find some case studies to explore with students or to curate for your patrons. Current awareness is really to support you as a library worker or educator or just somebody interested in these topics with places that you can go, publications you can follow, different areas that can help you stay up to date and build your current awareness of these issues in surveillance and big data and all those topics. Digging deeper is really, Sarah and I will geek out about theory a lot. So we call our teaching approach theory informed, but digging deeper is really going to link you out to some deeper reading and analysis of these issues. And finally, we also have a place for professional values and policy guidance. This would be like the ALA privacy toolkit or our code of ethics, things like that. So you can check this out, and hopefully this will be a resource that can help support you in whatever endeavors that you may have, whether it's just learning more or developing your own teaching experiences.
I had one question. We've been talking a lot about what individuals can do to protect their privacy. What can we as individuals do in the broader, more broadly to get, I don't know, to get Facebook or to get corporations or to get government involved in being concerned about what they can do to protect us as citizens?
Isn't that the truth? This is something Sarah and I grapple with a lot in our conversations, and we critique a lot in our workshops with students because it's always put onto the individual instead of talking about the systemic issues. And that's part of why we sometimes come across as fatalistic in our workshops because we realize that there's only we can only make so much difference and we can only control so much in our spheres. These algorithms are black boxes. There's very little to no accountability on how these systems are implemented increasingly in different areas of our world. One thing I think that was on the future horizon for us was to develop a workshop surrounded or about advocacy. We do in all of our guides have a tab that we like to mention to students about groups that are advocacy groups that maybe they can get involved in or follow, but we have not solved privacy in society yet, even though we would love to be a part of that. So I hope to someday in the near future do that. I think one of the big things we focus on because we work at a university is how we can help faculty integrate these sorts of conversations about ethics in technology, because it does really touch all disciplines. We're really focused on how can we get this in the curriculum, how can we get them focusing on these topics, because our students are the futures of these technologies, whether they're investing or developing or writing code. And so we think it's enormously important to instill a sense of ethics and responsibility in them now while they're with us. So that's one area that we're more involved in than others. But if you guys have ideas, we would love to know. We want to learn from everybody about how to do it, because it's a big task. I'll let Sarah talk if she has ideas.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks for that question, Melissa. I know we're just at time, but I dropped 2 additional links in the chat. There's a really interesting movement, in particular, more on the West Coast, although I think I found an example for New York, around local privacy coalitions. Thanks for joining us, Victor. Take care. I think this is recorded if you want to catch up on these last couple minutes. So these are kind of grassroots initiatives, and there are some where they've actually resulted in adding privacy councils to their local governance. So look, city governance boards, municipal governance boards. And so when new technology would be proposed under a city budget or for implementation in the local municipality, so think traffic cameras, right, at your traffic light cameras, that would actually go up for some kind of privacy impact review and have to be kind of greenlit, no pun intended, by this privacy governance board. So this is a really interesting area where they started as grassroots movements of local citizens just drawing attention to privacy issues, trying to create advocacy partnerships with, even law enforcement, as well as other areas of representation in their local governments, and then kind of becoming more and more formalized into the governance structure of their local municipality. So that's something that can also be done at a campus, in a local library, in a school, where you just kind of start to raise folks' awareness and then start to find the other interested people who have some energy to dedicate to these questions. And then as new decisions are coming down the pipeline and as money is being spent on initiatives or resources that may impact privacy, you can use resources released by these coalitions to undertake that kind of a privacy impact assessment, and then either issue a statement, issue some suggestions for how things might be configured, do ongoing audits, or eventually reach a point where you have enough decision-making power to really say, this is not a good fit for the privacy needs of our community, right? So these privacy coalitions are one really compelling model where I will say, I lean fairly libertarian politically. I'm very skeptical of privacy regulations. And if you want to become a skeptic, just either read FERPA or read HIPAA, and you'll realize they don't have a lot of teeth. They're very narrow in focus, and they have a lot of carve-outs for third-party access to data and what constitutes directory information under FERPA, things like that. But anyway, let me get off that soapbox. The idea being, as someone who is a privacy regulation skeptic, these privacy coalitions give me a lot of hope, where people can, in a very authentic and grassroots manner, actually start to accumulate decision-making power and kind of privacy enforcement power in their local settings. So is it a perfect answer? No. Do I think that ideally privacy regulations could come about like GDPR in Europe, which actually seems to have some teeth now? They're going after behemoths like Google Analytics, right? Which is really interesting to watch. I don't know how that would work in the American jurisdictional context, but it's interesting to think about. And ultimately, I think a matrix of different approaches, be they individual, collective at a community grassroots level, and then something more in a legal context, is ultimately what I think will provide ideal protections and solutions for privacy issues. So hopefully that gives you some hope as well. Thank you for that question.
Okay, so everybody has Sarah and Alex's information on the guides from that they posted in the chat, and I'm sure would welcome any questions afterwards. So with that, thank you again, Alex and Sarah, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.